Hello, welcome to CubsPS Plus, a Northside Numbers Game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. CubsPS Plus is part of the Bleacher Bunch Productions on the Fans First Sports Network, joining great shows like The Sun Ranto Show, Cup of Cubby Blue, and Baseball Rabbit Hole. The Bleacher Bunch feed is available wherever it is you get your podcasts, and CubsPS Plus is always available ad-free to Patreon supporters at patreon.com/CubsPS Plus, where you can support the show and find a variety of benefits for as little as $1 a month. In addition to the podcast feeds, you can also find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus. The spin on the baseball metric, OPS Plus. Love the pod or hate it? Please drop a review wherever it is you find your podcasts. And if you've done that, thank you so much. Maybe you could share an episode with a friend. It's July 9th, 2024. The Cubs are 42-49 as they head off to Baltimore to play the AL Best Orioles. Today marks 2 years of CubsPS Plus, and we're going to take a look back at how things have changed for the Cubs. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. Welcome to episode 81. No Cubs players ever worn number 81, but today is the second anniversary of the launch of CubsPS Plus, and the Cubs record in that time is 165 and 167, which is essentially an 81-win pace. It's been a surprisingly mid-performance overall for what I remember is a really bad team in the summer of 2022, and what really should have been a better team the last two seasons. So let's start there. This episode's going to be a lot of digging back into where were the Cubs, where was I when this podcast started. I'll do a little mix of business and personal because it's my show and I can. That's what I feel like doing today. I feel like this has been a journey. And to some extent, I think the Cubs and I have kind of been going through this together to some extent. But looking back, so the Cubs have gone 165 and 167, which when I saw that seemed absolutely impossible. I remember how bad the Cubs were, on July, heading into their game. They played the Dodgers late in LA on July 9th, 2022. And heading into that game, the Cubs were 34-50, 16 games under 500. They were going nowhere. This was the team that famously sold off on Blue Friday 2021, right? The trade deadline, traded away most of the rest of the core of the championship team. I mean, Anthony Rizzo, Chris Bryant, Javier Baez all got traded along with some, other arms. Andrew Chafin, Craig Kimbrell went over to the White Sox for Cody Hoyer and Nick Madrigal. A lot of things happened and a lot of things changed then. The Cubs clearly tanked for the rest of 2021. And coming into 2022, the roster was a bunch of, I don't want to say filler, but it was a mix of guys that were, let's grab a cheap vet to fill a hole, and let's see if this dude who played in the second half of 2021 is actually a dude. And so looking at that, the Cubs came in with guys like, Frank Schwindel, Alfonso Rivas, Rafael Ortega. It's still the back end of the Jason Hayward contract. Happ was here. Patrick Wisdom at the time, could he be an everyday player? Could he be a starter and be a guy who hits 30 home runs this season? So 2022 was all about basically F around and find out. I mean, that's what 2022 was all about. And for the most part, the first half of the season, they found out all the things they were hoping not to find out about. I mean, Frank Schwindel was not that guy. But love Frank. He will always forever have, the summer of Frank Schwindel. The whole Schwindy City summer. And to be a guy who played baseball his whole life. I mean, I love baseball my whole life. I played through high school, which honestly was probably a level beyond what I was actually capable of playing. I always tell my kids, if you love the game and want to play a little bit past what you're really capable of doing and find out. And Frank Schwindel, beat on the door of the major leagues forever and then got that chance after the Cubs traded Rizzo to the Yankees. And he took it. Like, who does that? I mean, I love stories like that. This guy who just, all his buddies from the Jersey Shore would come out and hang out in the bleachers. And I mean, it was just such a thing that summer. But in terms of winning baseball, like Frank Schwindel was not that guy. But the Cubs had to find out. So coming into that season, I mean, that was a bad baseball team. That was a season that at one point the infield actually consisted of an old Andrelton Simmons, Ildemaro Vargas, and Jonathan Villar, who just fell off a cliff. I mean, when the Cubs signed him that season, I figured he was one of those stability vet guys that had always been solid. He wasn't going to come over and be a star. He wasn't going to be like the anchor on a winning team, but damn, I figured he could play some competent defense and hit a little bit, but he just did not. Mix that in with, that was the year Christopher Morel came up and got off to his super hot start, which in retrospect, maybe that super hot start was not the best thing to ever happen to him. Maybe he could have used a little more time in the minors. But regardless, Nick Madrigal was there. Nico Horner was playing shortstop and showing that off for a good chunk of the season. Cubs still had Wilson Contreras. Everybody loves that guy, or at least a lot of us love that guy. It was the first year for Seiya Suzuki, first year for Marcus Stroman. That was the year that Ethan Roberts made the club out of spring training look like he was maybe going to be a very good bullpen piece, and then tore his UCL, and he's just come back in like the last week. So a lot has happened in that time. And so on June 9th, the Cubs were set to play LA, like I said. The Cubs lost 4-2 in that game. It was Marcus Stroman, who was coming back from injury, so he was only able to go 4 innings. He went 4 shutout innings, struck out 3, allowed 2 hits and a walk in 4 innings. Cubs wound up losing that game 4-2 to Clayton Kershaw, who threw 7 2/3, allowed 2 runs, only 1 was earned, struck out 10, walked none, gave up 5 hits. Just classic regular season Clayton Kershaw. And at that point, actually, Craig Kimbrell got the save in that game. So he had already tanked at the White Sox and got moved to LA. He's since gone to Philly, and now he's in Baltimore. So actually the Cubs might see him this week. Hopefully not, because hopefully Baltimore does not have any late leads. But I know what the odds of that are. But when I go back and look at that July 9th game, the starting lineup that day was Christopher Morel was leading off playing second base. Wilson Contreras was DHing, batting second. Patrick Wisdom hit third, playing third base. Seiya Suzuki cleanup right field. Nico Horner was batting fifth, playing short. Ian Happ was batting sixth, playing left. Yan Gomes, that was the first year of Yan Gomes too. He's batting seventh, catching. PJ Higgins was playing first base, batting eighth. And Nelson Velasquez was batting ninth, playing center field. I mean, you look up and down, and honestly, a lot of it's the game. I mean, the shift was still on. That was the last season of the shift. But batting averages were so much higher that year. I look up and down that batting order, and I know average is not everything, but you look at the batting averages. Christopher Morel, 272. Contreras, 270. Patrick Wisdom, 231. Seiya Suzuki, 256. Nico Horner was hitting 300. Ian Happ, 277. Yan Gomes, 208. PJ Higgins, 274. And Nelly was 224. But even OPS, like this team right now, Michael Busch leads the Cubs in OPS at 816. Now, again, some of it is the change in offense in the era a little bit, but look at these OPSs on July 9th. I mean, Christopher Morel, 832. Wilson Contreras, 877. Wisdom, 787. Seiya Suzuki, 808. Nico Horner, 757. Ian Happ, 821. Now, Yan Gomes was a lot more like this year's Yan Gomes, 527. PJ Higgins, 825. Nelson Velasquez, 650. Like, where's this offense gone? Now, last year's offense was good. They were third in the National League in runs scored. I want to say I think they were ninth overall in baseball. So this year's offense has clearly fallen off a cliff. But you look at that lineup. I mean, Wilson Contreras is gone. If we talk about the biggest changes to the roster between when I started this podcast, which was right before the All-Star break in 22, and where they are today, Wilson Contreras left. Marcus Stroman's moved on. And that's kind of it for departures, really. I mean, they've departed a lot of guys, so most of them we don't have to go through. They've brought in Jamison Tyone. They brought in Cody Bellinger twice. They made the trade for Michael Busch, who's looking really good right now. Christopher Morel has stuck. A lot more kids from the farm have come up. And it's been a really interesting time. And this is where I'm going to start to mix some of the personal with this. So I've loved podcasts for probably easily a decade, probably a little bit more. I don't remember when I first started listening. A lot of times it was started off as sports radio shows that I didn't listen to live, so I'd go and grab that day's episode off a podcast feed. And then I discovered that there were other podcasts available also. And I started listening to some Cubs podcasts. Like nationally, I've always liked Effectively Wild. That was one of the first ones I got into. Fangraphs podcast currently with Ben Lindbergh and Meg Rowley. Ben Lindbergh was on as a guest last year. And for the Cubs side, some of the first people I found were Cubs related with Corey Feldman and Brendan Miller. I think it was Growing Cubs at the time, but the Greg Huss podcast before Cubs Den that they have today. Son Ranto show. There were several that I found that were interesting, and I really liked the medium. I mean, I love being able to have a platform to have something to say. Nobody has to listen, but it allows me to get it out and lets me vent and speculate and put pieces together and play logic games and do all those things that I just love doing in my own head anyway. So I might as well turn a mic on and record some of it. And at the time, so I've been looking ahead to podcast ideas. I've still got a couple podcasts in my head that are not baseball or Cubs related that I want to work on soon. And of course, I've been saying that for a year plus now, but I've got 3 kids, I've got a job, this podcast. So it all takes up a bunch of my time. But, in the summer of 2022, I was coming off what had been a really rough, 15, 18 months of my life. So in the previous 15 months, first my mom had died, and then in end of March 2023 or 2022, my dad passed away. And so I lost both my parents within within a couple weeks of being exactly a year. That was a lot to go through, have my own kids, and then my job had changed a lot and I was hitting some career burnout. And so right around the time my dad passed, I stepped back from my job. I quit, was going to take some months off and figure out what it was I wanted to do next, kind of regroup and assess my mental health and figure out what's next, where do I want to go. And so that built in some time, and I started thinking about things, and I was mapping out a couple different podcast ideas. And at that point, I didn't know I knew hardly anything about certainly video editing, audio editing, recording, what makes a good recording, what life behind a mic is like. And so I was kind of struggling. I went back and forth. Do I script it? Do I freeform it? Do I just have bullet notes in front of my head with some web pages? And I finally realized that, the Cubs play every day, and the Cubs give content every day. There's something new to talk about. It's not that critical in the grand scheme of life, although we certainly feel it on a day-to-day basis. And it would just give me an opportunity to get reps behind the mic. So I decided to do that. And also, my relationship with the Cubs has ebbed and flowed over the years. So I've told my backstory before. I found the Cubs. I really found baseball in the World Series of 1981, the Yankees-Dodgers series. My parents, I've talked about, were Yankees fans because in the 1960s, they grew up in Iowa, and that's who was on TV every weekend. So they got to know those players. That's who they followed. Well, so I got interested in baseball late in 81, and at that point I was 7. So it's right about the time a lot of kids find baseball anyway. And then in the spring of 81, I found WGN. I found, Harry, 82, spring of 82. I think it was the end of Jack Prickhouse, actually. I don't think Harry Carey came till 83. I'd have to look that up. But I found the Cubs on WGN in the spring of 1982. And over the course of the summer, I grew up in Iowa. I was lucky enough to have cable. And so we wound up, the summertime you're a kid. I didn't do summer camps, so I was home a lot during the summer. Tons of playing with friends. And then, if I'm home, the Cubs are on TV. 81 home games a year. So except for when they're on the road, a lot of summer afternoons, when it's super hot outside and you've already been out playing for 5 hours, come in and watch some Cubs or come in and catch the end of the Cubs game. So that's when I really found the Cubs. That's when my love of baseball started. It was ramping up anyway. I was playing Little League Baseball. 8, 9, 10 that's when people fall in love with the game. And then when I was 10 was Rhinos. I talked a little bit about this with Michael Cotton a couple weeks ago, but when I was 10, that's when Ryan Sandberg had the Sandberg game, and that's when he won the MVP, and the Cubs won the division for the first time, and the first time they won really anything in 39 years. And when you're 10 and that magic happens, it just locks you in. So at that point, I was locked in. All through high school, followed the Cubs, total diehard, collected baseball cards, could tell you stupid trivia about all kinds of things that I'm still shocked I remember a good chunk of it. And then, I played my own high school baseball. So that ended in 1992. I was a bit player on a really good baseball team that wound up winning the state championship that year. And then that was the end of my career. I don't know. I suppose maybe I could have found a JUCO somewhere to play, but there weren't as many opportunities at that point as there are today. Certainly didn't have the coaching that, my kids have access to in Charlotte, North Carolina today. But in any event, that ended my baseball career. I went off to the University of Iowa for college life, and I spent a couple years without cable. So then I didn't have WGN at my fingertips all the time. And I still followed. I knew generally how they were doing. I would catch a game here and there if they're on ESPN or if I'm over to a friend's house that had cable. And I kind of missed it, whatever, but it's also a different phase of life. You're into other things. And get to the late 90s, and then it kind of resurrected again. You know, I'm out working on my own. I want to have cable, so I make sure I get it. I have WGN again, living in Pennsylvania. And Kerry Wood, Sammy Sosa, you like pull me back in. I never lost the game. I'm not one of those fans who dropped it after the strike in 94. I just was at a different point in my life where I wasn't following it in the same way. And so through my early professional life, I'm back to watching games when I can. Right? I didn't have kids at this point, but I was still dating the woman that would become my wife. We got married. We moved a couple times. And it's early in your career. You got to put time in. I can't watch day games like I used to. And you know, it goes. And then 2003, I finished grad school. We relocated again. And I wound up spending, because of a move and a dip in the economy and all that, I wound up unemployed for about 6 months while it was kind of before and then after my first son was born. And that happened to be the summer of 2003. So again, like sucked all back into baseball. I watched like every game that season. At that point I had TiVo. So if I wasn't able to see a game, I could DVR it and just go from there. And so ever since I've continued to follow. Again, if the team's really bad and I'm really busy professionally with my kids and whatnot, you know, kind of ebbs and flows, but I've remained strongly connected. But, you know, through the years kind of post 2016, 2017, so from like 2019 to 2022, those were the prime years for my oldest, who was a pitcher. He really got into travel ball, was playing high school ball. I'm not talking elite travel teams, but we were playing, you know, I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. We were playing tournaments anywhere from, you know, Virginia to Georgia, wherever. You know, it's a lot going on, a lot of following his baseball, a lot of having him out, you know, throwing, doing all the things. And it kind of sucked some of my time away from the Cubs. So I'd follow them and I'd watch games here and there, but nothing like, certainly not trying to catch some of or all of every game. You know, a game or two a week was probably my max. But then all of a sudden he graduated in 22. So his high school baseball season ended in early mid-May 2022. And so at that point, I'm unemployed. My love of baseball is still there. Following him and his journey through high school ball was over. And so what do I do next? And so it allowed me to jump back into the Cubs. And I started watching them more every day. And I got more involved with that team. And at the time, you know, I have as many hot takes as everybody else. You know, I have stupid ideas, some of which I've said on this podcast. But it kind of gave me a chance, you know, not having the work conflicts. His baseball's over. We did some travel, graduation, getting him ready to go off to college. And my youngest was still playing, but at the time he was 10. I guess he was 11 actually, but he had been 10 that spring Little League season. And so he was not at a point yet where he had decided whether or not he was going to be a serious baseball player. So that's a more laid back thing. And I thought, let's do this. And I get into it. And it was a fascinating time to jump into the Cubs. Because at this point, nobody really knew what to think about Jed. I mean, some people will tell you they hated him from the start, whatever. But Theo Epstein left. It turned out to be Jed. Didn't have to be Jed. But he left the next guy in charge of the Cubs in a bit of a lurch. You know, for years, I've talked about it. You know, he built up this team, did a tremendous job building up, won the 2016 World Series, had a team in 2017 that could have won it. Honestly, had a team in 2018 that could have won it. You know, 2017, they kind of went through a bit of a post-World Series funk, but that's pretty common. I mean, look at the Rangers this year. You know, there's often a bit of a World Series hangover, and the Cubs went through that. 2017, again, they weren't the best team. They kind of had to push late to win the division, but they still made it to the NLCS and just got beat by a better Dodgers team. 2018, that team won 95 games. They got exhausted down the stretch, and I could get into a million reasons why that team didn't go any further. But don't let the way that season ended, you know, the late push by Milwaukee. I think they had to win their last 8 straight to even push a game 163. Then losing game 163 and then losing the wild card 1-game playoff to the Rockies. Don't let that change the fact that that was a 95-win baseball team that could just as easily have gotten hot down the stretch and gone a completely different direction. 2019, 2020 really started the fade, and Jed never really did anything about that core. He had, Addison Russell turned out ultimately didn't develop, had his off-field issues, and they moved him along. But Javier Baez, Chris Bryant, Kyle Schwarber, Anthony Rizzo, Wilson Contreras, they did wind up extending Kyle Hendricks. But out of all those position players that filled all those roles, and again, we can get into history and revisionist history and decide what should or would the Cubs have done. It's easy to take what we know in 2022 or 2024 and apply it to, summer of 2021. But the reality is the Cubs had a lot of assets that were incredibly valuable, never made much effort to extend any of them. There were offers granted, and maybe the Cubs really pushed hard on a couple of them, but whatever. In the end, they did not extend any of those guys. They did not trade any of those guys when they were at peak value. And in the case of Kyle Schwarber, they actually non-tendered him, literally got nothing for him. Now, going back and looking, I don't think Kyle Schwarber would have made it through the 2021 season. I think it would have been the Cubs traded Jock Peterson, who they replaced Kyle Schwarber with for basically the same money. So, that's about what it's about. They got rid of Yu Darvish, all those things that played into it. But that core, the Cubs never made any of them an ongoing piece, and the Cubs never traded any of them for value earlier. Wilson Contreras, they basically let walk. At least they got a comp pick from him, which turned out to be Jackson Wiggins, so we'll see what happens to him in the next couple of years. But what I would like to see the Cubs do, and what I think is actually Jed's plan, is to establish a kind of a ongoing developing core. If you have, I don't want to build a team that's got 6 guys for the next 3 years and then who knows what after it. I would love to have a good player locked up for 6 years, a good player locked up for 4 years, a good player locked up for 2 years, so that allows you to transition. If they're free agent signings, maybe the players get older and you just let them go. If it's a young kid coming up, you have to decide, is this a guy I want to lock up and have around for, say, another 4 years once he hits free agency and have him for the bulk of his career? Or is this a guy I want to trade with a year or two of control left because I've got other players that play that same position, and this is an opportunity to trade from strength and shore up something else and kind of change my window? Those competitive windows should evolve, and that's something that the Cubs never did under Theo Epstein. All those players got older and expensive together. So my first episode, July 9th, 2022, the title was Who's Trade Bait? So we're heading into the trade deadline season just like we are now. That Cubs team was clearly going nowhere, and it was clearly built to have pieces to sell. And so the big expectation was that Wilson Contreras and maybe even Ian Happ would get traded. Now, Contreras famously didn't. There was the strong report that the Cubs had a deal in place with the Astros that was nixed by the Astros owner, or maybe Dusty. Ian Happ was a guy that still had a year plus of control left, so I think the Cubs just didn't get what they were hoping to get for him. They're not even hoping to get. I think they probably put him out there with a certain price in mind. That price wasn't met, so there's no reason to trade him. And then number 2, my second podcast, which would be, I think it was exactly a week later. I think it was July 16th. There have been times I've been really good about being a weekly to the day, and other times, life gets in the way. But I was talking about signs of improvement. Kind of Nico Horner was kind of coming on. Ian Happ was really establishing himself as a good, solid player. And it just became, where's this team going to go? And like I said, the rest of that season was about finding out about some guys. And we did find out about some guys. That was the year we found out about Justin Steele. That was the year that Justin Steele kind of emerged, especially in the second half of the season, as a guy who could be a starting pitcher and be a pretty good one. Keegan Thompson kind of went the other way. They both started the season in bullpen roles. And by the end of that season, Keegan Thompson looked like he could absolutely kill it in a multi-inning bullpen role. Now he's kind of had ups and downs since then. 2023 was awful for him. But Justin Steele, famously was a Cy Young candidate last year. And so if I go back, I went to Fangraphs and I used the splits tool to take a look at Cubs players in different positions since July 8th, 2022. And I don't think it's probably any surprise that the player with the most plate appearances for the Cubs during that time is Ian Happ. And his numbers are right where you'd expect them to be. He's a good baseball player. During that time, he slashed 249, 345, 433 for an OPS just a little below 800, 117 WRC plus. Seiya Suzuki's actually in terms of plate appearances, Seiya Suzuki's number 3. Nico Horner's actually number 2 at 268, 336, 337 with a 100 WRC plus. There are times that Nico Horner looks like a really good major league hitter, and then when you look at a big sample size, it winds up being kind of about average. And that's kind of who he is. Like he's a very competent offensive player. He's got a lot of speed. Since July 8th, 2024, he has stolen, I think, 70 bases. Yeah, 70 bags, been caught 10 times. And he gives you a ton of defensive value. Like right now, he's one of the guys being talked about at this trade deadline. Is he, the Cubs are not built to sell. The Cubs do not have a bunch of expiring contracts. The Cubs do not have a bunch of obvious, just get this guy, move him along and fill the spot. And a lot of the guys that they do have that could be very attractive trade pieces at the deadline have complications. Ian Happ and Seiya Suzuki have no trade clauses. Cody Bellinger has 2 player options over the next 2 years. Those guys become not impossible to trade by any stretch, but more complicated to trade because we don't know what Cody's going to want to do at the end of the season. I don't know where Seiya Suzuki or Ian Happ would be open to playing baseball. And, so Nico Horner's a guy that plays a key position because the Cubs have a number of other players right now that can play second base. And he'd be attractive, and he might even be more attractive to another team especially defensively than he is to the Cubs because he can play a really, really good shortstop. In 2022, I don't remember the exact voting, but he should have been a finalist for the Gold Glove that year. Dansby Swanson won the Gold Glove, and he deserved it. But Nico Horner was up in that conversation, and Nico Horner can go somewhere else and play shortstop too. So if a team is down a middle infielder, if they're really struggling to get any kind of production or defensive value at shortstop, he's a guy that might make a lot of sense. He's got a reasonable contract for the next 2 seasons. So he's a guy you could plug in and focus on some other areas. And for the Cubs, it would give them a chance to plug in somebody who probably does provide more offensive value in the near term. Probably not as much defensive value. But the question is, would that difference be enough? Or would the fact that you cleared second base, maybe slide a Michael Busch or Christopher Morel to second base, does that allow you then to move other people around defensively to bring in a much bigger bat? In which case, yes, you're going to lose some defensive value with Nico Horner at second base, but you're going to more than make up for that by picking up offense at multiple positions. That's really the thought process there. But you look down through the top plate appearances, and a lot of them aren't surprising. It's Ian Happ, and then it's Nico Horner, and then it's Seiya Suzuki and Christopher Morel, Dansby Swanson, Cody, Mike Tauchman being 8th in plate appearances over the last 2 years is kind of telling. And you go down the bottom, and the bottom of this just kind of tells the guys the Cubs have gone through and have struggled, and the Cubs have had to move along. You go back through the bottom 10 guys, or Andrelton Simmons, Luis Torrens, Tomas Nido, who's just come in recently, Edwin Rios, Michael Hermosillo, Garrett Cooper, who the Cubs had earlier this season, Alexander Canario, who somehow is only at 42 career plate appearances and yet never seems to get a shot, even as he just continues to hit bombs for Iowa. Esteban Quiros, Frank Schwindel, Jared Young, Eric Hosmer. It's been a struggle. And if you go to the pitching side, so let's look at some other numbers. Let's look at home runs. The Cubs leader in home runs during that period is Christopher Morel. He's hit 48 home runs since June 8th or July 8th, 2022. Ian Happ's at 43, Seiya Suzuki's at 40, Bellinger's at 35, Patrick Wisdom at 34. But not a huge amount of power. I mean, Dansby Swanson hit 20 plus last year. He's at 30. That's what the Cubs are missing. They don't have that big bopper in the lineup. Christopher Morel could maybe ideally be that guy, but this year he's really struggling to make the regular stats, the actual stats, meet the projected stats. There are a bunch of reasons for that. Some of it, I think, is a lack of aggression. I think he made the big adjustment. I've talked about this many times, so I won't spend much time on it here. He's made the big adjustment to reduce his strikeout rate, but I think that's cost him a little bit of aggressiveness at the plate. And beyond that, they don't really have I think Seiya Suzuki, if he could stay healthy and stay consistent over the course of a season, is a guy who I think could hit 30, 35 home runs. But he just hasn't done that for the Cubs. He's missed a month plus every season he's been with the Cubs. And I don't know, it's now the oblique a couple times, so I don't know if that's something chronic that he's going to have to figure out how to work around or if it really is just flukish. But, that's how it's going to go. Those things have gotten in the way. Cody Bellinger had really had a great second half last year. He wasn't even super, super great. The first half, he had an injury. He had an injury this year. Hopefully Bellinger will get right and go in the second half, and maybe he's traded. I don't know. But we go through this, and it's been the build. So for the Cubs, it's been all about how do I get from a 34-50 record into the playoffs. And they almost did it last year. And I think where the Cubs have come up short, and this is my growing criticism of Jed. I'm not gonna play retrospective or revisionist history and go back and say that I thought he did a pretty good job in 2021. I liked a lot of those trades, and some of those trades actually still look pretty good. The Cubs could still get pretty big value out of Daniel Palencia and potentially Alexander Canario, and Caleb Killian hopefully is going to be back in the bullpen soon. He looked great in the spring. Kevin Alcantara is still a top 100 prospect coming through the system. He was just young. The Cubs got Owen Casey for the Yu Darvish trade. I will always hate the Yu Darvish trade, but hopefully Owen Casey at least proves to have some big value. So I didn't really have massive problems with what Jed did at that point. Even in 2022, I was okay with not spending a ton of money on the free agent market. They did go get some guys. They got Seiya Suzuki because they didn't have an heir apparent in the outfield that was clearly ready for Major League Baseball. They got Marcus Stroman, and he, when he was healthy, he pitched well for them. And he got them on reasonable deals. I mean, Seiya Suzuki still is paid pretty appropriately for what he's produced. Marcus Stroman was paid pretty appropriately for what he produced, and then he was maybe a little overpaid, but only because of the injuries. When he was in and he was healthy, he was really good. And then last year, kind of the end of 2022 into 2023, started to show some of the signs that would be ongoing sources of frustration with the Jed in the front office. And at the end of 2022, you could have gotten a read on Matt Mervis to find out, what do we have? Is this a guy that's going to hit Major League pitching? I'm still not sure we have a big enough sample size to know. But he certainly didn't get any time in 2022. Then 2023, because of the way the season went, they brought him up early after, and because they didn't know what Matt Mervis was, that led them to sign both Hosmer and Mancini, which blocked Mervis. And then by the time they let Hosmer go, they had called up Mervis, let him go. He only had about for his career, he only has 116 plate appearances, and most of those, about 100 of those, were last year. I really believe a guy needs, if you think he's anything, and you think there's a chance he's anything, I think he's 150, 200, maybe 250 plate appearances to really know what you have. I thought last year, while he wasn't super outstanding, I thought Miguel Amaya looked vaguely promising at the plate. He was clearly the number 2 behind Yan Gomes, and he was kind of playing third catcher behind Tucker Barnhart for a while, but he did enough to push Tucker Barnhart out. But, Now at this point, he is up to 306 at bats and 349 plate appearances. Sorry, on Mervis, it's 127 plate appearances. He did have about 100 last year. It's 116 at bats. And it's just not enough. So when the team was bad in 2022, I don't think the Cubs did enough. They did a good job showcasing some of those mid-tier guys, some of those 26, 27 kind of older-ish players that you'd have a bunch of control on if it turns out that there's something. Frank Schwindel, Rafael Ortega, those guys got a lot of run. And the Cubs found out and made the appropriate moves. They didn't get enough on Mervis. I don't think they ever got enough on Nelson Velasquez. I don't know that it would have changed anything. The Cubs are super deep in outfield prospects, and Nelson was always ranking below the other players. They traded him for Jose Cuas last year, who I've said on the show I was optimistic about it. I liked his stuff. Didn't pan out, went to Iowa, couldn't find the command. The Cubs let him go. Now he's doing, not finding his control in Toronto. So a lot of these just don't pan out. But so the Cubs still maybe don't know what they have with Matt Mervis. Now they've got Michael Busch. They've kind of started to spin that. And the offseason of 2023 I was happy with it. And also, I was mostly happy with it, I'll be honest. I like Dansby Swanson's player profile. Actually, the guy I really wanted that offseason was Xander Bogaerts. I want no part of that contract he wound up getting with the Padres. I mean, 11 years, 280 is insanity. I thought they got a fair price for Dansby. He's going to give you Gold Glove defense consistently. Even this season, the first couple of weeks he got off to a rough start with the glove, but you look at his defensive metrics, he's 99th, 100th percentile across the board. So he's going to give you defense. The question is now, is his bat aging poorly, or is this a bad season? Or is he playing hurt? Because that's the other thing with Dansby Swanson. He came in coming off a season where he played 162 games with Atlanta. He loves to play every day. I love that about him. But you can't let a guy play every day, especially at a position like shortstop. We saw at the end of the season how worn down he was. We see through stretches, he hurt his knee against Houston. He played like 2 more weeks and played horrendously. And then he goes on the IL, comes back, and one of his better streaks this season was after that rest after the injured list. One of Dansby's best streaks last year was when he came off the injured list, and I think it was July, and went on an absolute tear for like 2 weeks because he's rested. Just get the guy some regular rest, and hopefully his bat will recover a little bit. Because I made a tweet the other day that he went through an 0 for 23 stretch. The time I made the tweet, I said his prior 6 games he was 0 for 21 with 12 Ks. And he just looks lost. Now, he did get a hit on Sunday, so that's good. Maybe that's a springboard. He did have Cubs had an off day on Monday. But like Sunday would have been a really good time. Give him the day off. Let him have 2 days in a row off. Maybe get to Baltimore early. I guess they had travel day Monday, so it didn't really matter. But, just get a couple days off. Rest those legs. If you want to do a little timing thing and, a little bit of work in the cage or something to get some timing going, go for it. But so I like the Dansby Swanson move. I like the Jameson Taillon move. Now, he was really rough the first part of last year. He was a lot better in the second half, and he's been great this year. What I didn't like, I didn't love getting both Hosmer and Mancini. I was fine with either, was not thrilled with both. Like the Cody Bellinger pickup last year. It was low risk. But this is now what we're starting to see with Jed. Now, for a while with this build, there was really nothing. You're not going to go sign in the offseason prior to the 2022 season. Go get one superstar free agent. Now, I would like, if they had a superstar every year and we're just willing to go spend Mets money, awesome. I'm all in for that. But if they're going to be a team that hovers between, this year the CBT threshold is $237 million. If you're going to be a team that's going to hover between, say, 220 and 255, you're willing to spend up to it to start the season, add more, whatever, and or potentially go over and go to the first tier. That's plenty of money to win. It's not my ideal path. Again, my ideal path would be to have an owner like Steve Cohen. Although the Mets are not going that great. The money was not spent wisely either. But I want a team that's going to spend competitive money, and the Cubs do that. And the Cubs have increased the spending. The problem is the Cubs have increased the spending on a lot of players that they don't have anymore. Last year they carried $22 million due to Jason Hayward. This year they're paying $10 million to Tucker Barnhart and Trey Mancini. It looked like early in the season they might have to cut ties with Kyle Hendricks and cut that $16 million. But the problem is they're playing this whole game in the margins, and some of the margin plays are strong and make a lot of sense, and there's a lot of logic behind them. And I can see the dollar cost averaging and all the accountant business sense in there. And then there's just not that one star in this lineup that the Cubs would put out there to make other teams fear. It's been that way for a while. And the old core, there were times where the offense was, famously, quote, broken. So it's not like they were all hot all the time. But you go through that 2016 lineup, and there were guys up and down that lineup that Anthony Rizzo, Ben Zobrist, Chris Coughlin, Tommy La Stella, those guys would give you great professional at-bats every time up. Then other guys, and Chris Bryant too. But Chris Bryant was young in his career, but he was always willing to be patient and take a walk and work a count. And then you had guys, Javi Baez, Kyle Schwarber, and, KB that could give you that big upside, that just massive power potential, can just go after a pitch and go. And it just seems like as this team has evolved, they've never taken that next big step. Signing Marcus Stroman was a good free agent signing. Signing Seiya Suzuki was a good free agent signing. Getting Jameson Taillon was a good signing. Dansby Swanson is a good baseball player. They extended Ian Happ and Nico Horner, who are good baseball players. There's not a lot of great. If I look up and down this roster today and look for great, Shota Imanaga started the season great. We'll see. He's fallen back a little bit as the league adjusts to him. That's how things go. But he's a 30-year-old coming over from Japan, so he already has professional chops, and he already knows how to work hitters and all that. So it's adjusting to the U.S. and Major League Baseball and a different schedule and a different calendar. But he's been very good. Justin Steele, borderline great. He did not win the Cy Young last year, hit, max innings by far for his career last year, got tired down the stretch. Somehow, I took my family to the Labor Day game last year when he threw that 8-inning, and it's hard to imagine that he literally just this weekend won his first game, got his first win since then, because he's continued to pitch great baseball. If I look at the pitching numbers since July of 2018, if I look at innings, he's thrown the most innings of anybody in that span. It's Justin Steele at 295, Drew Smiley at 237, Jameson Taillon at 235 and 2/3, Javier Assad surprisingly at 230, and Marcus Stroman at 228. And Kyle Hendricks is the only other guy over 200 innings during that span. It's a little bit crazy, but during that span, Justin Steele's numbers, and so this includes some of 2022, obviously the second half of 2022, and he was good, but certainly not necessarily elite. 2.80 ERA, 3.07 FIP, 7.6 WAR in the 2 years. He's just incredible. And you look at some of his, advanced stats. He's got. Let me redo the sort here. Let me find him. He's at 9.23 Ks per 9 innings, only 2 walks per 9, 25% K rate, 5.6% walk rate, 235 batting average against. His numbers have been consistent. They've held up, and he's been a really valuable pitcher. And the Cubs have had some bullpen guys emerge. The Cubs have had finally some young pitchers emerge. We're seeing Jordan Wicks, who was just drafted in the 2021 draft. He made his debut last season. Cade Horton was drafted 2022. I think maybe we'd have already seen him this year, except that he had his own injury and now hasn't pitched since I think it's May 29th. So hopefully he'll be able to get back. But during this time, the Cubs have continued to pile up depth in the system. The farm system is now widely rated as the second in baseball behind the Baltimore Orioles. And the Cubs have all this bubbling depth, and it is now time for the Cubs to no longer look at, I don't want to say you don't want to maximize value, because obviously you do. you don't want to go waste a bunch of stuff anywhere. But the Cubs are a big enough market team. The Cubs have some money coming off the books, and it's time for the Cubs to go take some of this prospect depth. They have, 4 outfielders, I think, in the top 100, or close. They definitely have 3. They might have 4. And that includes PCA, whom for the most part has just graduated off of prospect lists. And the Cubs have 3 outfield spots, with Ian Happ and Seiya Suzuki theoretically filling up 2 of those spots for the next 2 years, plus Cody Bellinger potentially around for 2 more years. All of those guys are not going to start in Chicago together. So start packaging some of those guys and go get a big impact bat somewhere. This offseason, take some of that money that's coming off the books. Kyle Hendricks, $16 million is going to be gone. Cody Bellinger might opt out. If he does, that's another $27 million out. The Cubs have the $10 million in dead money from Mancini and Hosmer coming off the books. They get Yan Gomes $6 million back. Put that money towards a big bat. Now, again, where? In the offseason, prior to this, kind of about where we are now, a lot of people have talked about go get Pete Alonso. I would love Pete Alonso in this lineup. He's going to hit for a ton of power. He's a good overall hitter. But unless you're going to line him up at DH, or unless you're going to trade Nico Horner and slide Michael Busch over to second, Michael Busch is basically better than, putting up basically the same numbers, but a little bit better than Pete Alonso this year. So where can the Cubs look to get that clear upgrade? Now, if you're sliding Michael Busch over to second base, you're putting Alonso at first, or you're putting Alonso at DH, and maybe you're putting Christopher Morel at second base. There are other ways to make that happen. There are also other guys available. It doesn't have to be the free agent. I don't necessarily care if the Cubs sign a massive free agent. That's always fun. Cubs have not, to this date, given out a contract bigger than $200 million. Now, they have, with Cody Bellinger, offered theoretical $30 million per year. They've given $25 million plus a couple times. So that'll get you some good players. The elite players are going to be making, the elite players that hit free agency, you're talking superstar. So we're talking Juan Soto hitting free agency next year. Those guys are making $40 million plus. And it's only going up from here. I would love it if the Cubs would go sign Juan Soto. I don't even care who's coming up in the system. You get a talent like Juan Soto, who's going to be, I think, 26 next year. Prime of his career, elite offensive player. His floor is super high because dude walks all the time. There's no downside. And if you wind up blocking some kids, then trade him for pitching or trade him for a third baseman or whatever. The Cubs will have a million options. Or take a look around baseball. There are teams with good young players that are approaching free agency. Or, and I don't mean, I don't want the Cubs to trade a bunch of prospects for a rental this year. I think unless the Cubs go on some absolute tear after the All-Star break in July, that's not this Cubs team. They don't need to just go desperately add a piece. But this is a team that should be looking forward. Every move they make for the rest of this calendar year should be 100% based on making 2025 a division-winning baseball team. They can go be buyers at this deadline, but they got to be buying guys that have more than just the rest of this year as control. I've seen Vladimir Guerrero's name tossed around. I don't know if he's a guy the Cubs would want or if he's a guy the Cubs necessarily even should get. But he is got a big power bat, and he's under control through the end of the 2025 season. So you could bring him in now. Maybe he gives you a boost. Maybe he helps you go on some run in August and September. But he's also here for 2025. Maybe trade an established player that maybe does make you a little bit worse. Like I mentioned, Nico Horner. Maybe the Cubs get around the no-trade clause with Ian Happ or Seiya Suzuki. Maybe the Cubs work out a deal with somebody and throw some extra cash or a contingency if Cody Bellinger opts in to move him along. That should be done to open up potential spots to upgrade in the offseason and or to allow the top prospects from the farm system to make it up. The one frustration I've seen, and I mentioned this already, one of my frustrations is as the talent in the system has risen and gotten closer to the major leagues, the Cubs have not done a good enough job of letting that talent come up and find a way to play. You don't necessarily have to come. I think they're doing the right thing with Pete Crow Armstrong right now. And he's been hurt the last couple of days ever since he sliced up his thumb sliding into third base. But he doesn't necessarily have to play every day, but find a way to get him in the lineup. The Cubs lock in, and for the better part of 2 weeks at least straight, virtually every single day was Nico Horner at second, Dansby Swanson at short, alternate the catchers, and then typically it's Christopher Morel at third base, and then it's Bush at first, and then, or maybe Bush DHs with Bellinger at first, and then it's Happ, Saya, Pete Crow Armstrong, or Cody Bellinger in the outfield with one of those guys at DH. The same guys like every day for 2 weeks. If you give everybody a day off, if you give Nico Horner 1 day off out of every 10 days to 2 weeks, if you give Dansby Swanson a day off every 10 days to 2 weeks, if you give Cody Bellinger, Ian Happ, Seiya Suzuki a game off every 10 days, that's 5 players. You've created 5 extra opportunities for playing time. Do the same with Christopher Morel. He doesn't need to be playing literally every single day. Maybe he gets a day off every week. So that kind of clears out another 2. Michael Bush gets maybe a day or 2 off every 10 days, 2 weeks. You're creating at that point 7 or 8 starting opportunities that can go to your deep bench. So that could go to David Bodie and Miles Mastrobuoni and Patrick Wisdom. Maybe that's not ideal, whatever. But we've seen Miles Mastrobuoni had a good game the other day when he got to play. When he had to fill in last year when Dansby Swanson and Nick Madrigal were hurt, he got some extended reps or some regular reps, and he played pretty well for a couple month stretch. We've seen Patrick Wisdom go on heaters. But maybe more importantly than those guys, you could potentially move those guys along and play Alexander Canario. Let him come up and take 2 starts a week in the outfield, maybe DH as a third day, and then as a bat off the bench. Maybe we get to see Owen Casey. There are opportunities to bring these guys up. Matt Mervis, give him another shot. Again, you need to know what you have on these guys. Luis Vasquez inexplicably came up as soon as Nico and Dansby were both healthy and got 1 or 2 plate appearances and went back down. At some point very soon, we're going to have Matt Shaw and James Triantos knocking at the door for playing time. Find a way to work these in. And that's something that I always thought was going to be a strength with, really, I thought it would be a strength with David Ross. It turned out not to be. David Ross played under Joe Madden and seemed to very much, I thought, share that philosophical outlook that one thing about Joe, and Joe would frustrate us sometimes because he would play all of his core and then the last game of a series or the last day of a road trip or the last day of a homestand was just the entire bench would play, which is not necessarily ideal. But he found a way to get everybody reps, and that really helped in that stretch from 2015 to 2018. There were always guys off the bench that maybe Chris Coughlin or Tommy LaStella didn't play a ton. Maybe they only started once a week, twice a week. But they got enough work that they were fresh when they came in off the bench, and they got some big hits off the bench. Right now, we see earlier this season, I had a tweet about Miles Mastrobuoni. I think at the time he was 0 for 13 on the season with 9 or 10 Ks. But I went down and broke down his at-bats. All of his at-bats, except for one game he started against Colorado, he was facing Dylan Cease or closers. If you're only getting an at-bat, 1 or 2 at-bats every 10 days and it's against elite pitching, you're not going to hit. Nobody's going to hit. Luis Ariz would probably hit fine. But those guys are going to have more at-bats. So anybody who's in a bench role needs to get some regular work to be fresh, and that's been an area of frustration now going on 2 seasons, really going on maybe 3 seasons. So there are ways to get these kids up, get them playing time, especially if the Cubs fall any further out of the race, if they do deal 1 or 2 guys out of this lineup. Get kids up, find a way to make it work. You can still, Ian Happ or Seiya Suzuki or Cody Bellinger are still here. They can still get all the work they need. They can still start. Typically you play 12 or 13 games every 2 weeks. It sometimes tightens up in the back of the season as you stack up a couple rainouts have to take up off days. 12, 14 games in 2 weeks. start 10 or 11 of them. That opens up a couple starts for somebody else and allows you to start to see more. And then maybe on a particular, maybe Alexander Canario gets a couple days in a row. He plays left field for Happ one day and plays right for Saya the next day. And he puts a couple games together. Well, maybe you find a way to keep him in the lineup. Maybe he's the one that gives PCA a day off the next day. Maybe he DHs. Maybe he sits one game and comes back in. Like there are all kinds of ways to make this work that the Cubs haven't. And looking back over the time I've done this podcast, that's kind of my ongoing frustration. They've not been bold enough. Take that bigger step. Work the kids in the lineup. I thought that's what Craig Counsell consistently did in Milwaukee. So I don't know now if this is some sort of dictate from the front office or if this is Craig Counsell feeling that pressure. This team should be better than they are right now to win. But whatever it is, like it's not really working. And that's really my big, when I look back at the Cubs over the time I've done this podcast, is be bolder. Take that bigger move. It was fine for a while. You had to build the system, let these kids come up to the top of the system, and don't be too anxious to, trade a bunch of prospect capital for pieces you're not sure about. Now this year, when they made the Michael Busch trade, that was great. Now I'm high on both Jackson Ferris and Zaire Hope. I think they both look like really talented baseball players and probably are. I haven't looked at all the revised midseason prospect lists, but Jackson Ferris is probably going to be there soon, and Zaire Hope might not be too far behind him. But the Cubs took a couple guys who probably aren't going to see the major leagues until 2026 or 2027 and turned them into, see, Almonte looked really good at the start of the season before he got hurt. Now he's done for the season. But Michael Busch looks like a real legitimate major league hitter. He's strikeouts are something to watch, and I'll watch the balance. I would like him to lower that strikeout rate, but not lose some of the aggression that I feel like Christopher Morel has. But Michael Busch has certainly a ton of doubles power. I think he's a guy who could hit 25 to 30 home runs as he matures and his plate approach. But that's the kind of move I want to see the Cubs make. Although at some point you got to go for a higher profile guy. Michael Busch has worked out. That's great. And if you see a guy you absolutely believe in, go get him. I saw a lot of pro and con Michael Busch at the time of the trade, but clearly from the start, Jed Hoyer, front office, and then by extension Craig Counsell believed in that guy. They committed to him at first base. When he inevitably hit his struggle when the league adjusted to him, they did pull him back and kind of reduce his playing time for a while to let him work through it. But he did. Now he's back out there, and he's been their best and most consistent hitter the entire season. And so that's the kind of stuff that, kind of looking back and looking at my own personal journey through this as a podcaster. It's weird to have that title. That's not one I thought I would ever have. Being able to kind of step back from the game, as a fan, you're in, you want them to win, or maybe you're passively following. If you're passively following, you're not that into the day to day. You're not scrutinizing every move. I see a lot of the casual takes on Facebook, and got into yesterday on a thing with a guy saying that Busch hasn't been very good lately. I mean, he's only hitting 300 with an OPS over 850 since the start of June. So I don't know what lately means or what not good is. But, when you're into this and following every day, it's very easy to get caught up in the game. But the podcast has given me a chance to think about it on a different level. Not that I'm some inherent genius. There are plenty of people that know a lot more baseball than me. I try to bring a little bit of a different voice. There are a ton of Cubs podcasts out there, a lot of really, really good ones. I'm not even going to try to name them because I would miss several that I listen to on a regular basis. But there's such a variety of voices. There are people players, he and Happ and Justin Steele have podcasts. That's a perspective I can't give you. They can talk about what it's like to be in the locker room and go on road trips and talk to Zach Short about signing the inside of Fenway Park's scoreboard. I can't give you any of that. There are the beat writers, CHGO's Ryan Herrera, Sahadev Sharma's on podcasts, and Patrick Mooney. And those guys can give you an access I can't give you. We've seen broadcasters, let in JD at a podcast for a while, and I'm not sure what, I don't think Boog has anything right now, but those guys give a different perspective. There are people who have been on the analytical side of baseball. Corey Friedman has worked for a team, and Brendan Miller can give you the scientific, breakdowns of pitching metrics and all that kind of stuff. There are also people that just give you the fan voice. And it's all good, and there's a voice out there for everybody, so listen to who you like, and the prospect guys, Greg Huss, Greg Zumak, Brian Smith, do a fantastic job. Bunch of others. There are like daily radio shows. There are analytics shows. I try to bring perspective, and CubsPS Plus, I'm a numbers-friendly podcast, but it's not just a straight math breakdown every day. I try to look back and look at the trends and look at where things are going and where the Cubs could do better. I also try to play some devil's advocate. If I hear a lot of times that so-and-so sucks or this is not going well, I'll dig in numbers like, is it really that bad? And sometimes it is. Sometimes it really is that bad. And other times, you know what? It's not that bad. And that's where to bring this back to the top of the episode, I thought I'm going to pull what the record was since I started the podcast. I did not expect to see 165 and 167. Now, when I think about it, with where they are this year, they're 7 games under 500 right now, and they were 4 over last year. So that's a net -3. And so what I lost was how bad the Cubs were when I started compared to the end of the season. They really played, they were 5 under 500 baseball the rest of that season. So the overall record is not what I expected it to be, but it's been a lot of mid. And that's something, when I talk about Jed being bold, that's something that the Cubs are, they still have the good prospect capital to work with, the good players coming up through the system. They're treading in that danger zone of mid. Sometimes there's nothing worse than being consistently 77 to 83 wins, which is where they've been. You don't get the top draft picks. Now, the lottery may help. The Cubs could have a season where let's say they do, they're not going to tank this season, but let's say it doesn't really get much better from here. And they're 7 under. Maybe they finish 10 under. So maybe they go, I don't think they will, but let's say they do. And that's 86 and 76. Or 76 and 86, the other way. I'd rather see them go 86 and 76 and have a shot at the playoffs for sure. But, maybe they have a season where they're, 77 to 80 wins and they get lucky in the draft lottery and get a top 4 pick. That'd be great. But where the Cubs built the last core was a complete tank. They were atrocious coming out of after the 2009, 2010 season. They were awful. Purged a lot of big contracts. They were dreadful from 2011 to 2014 under Tom Ricketts' ownership. But that was the goal. They brought in Theo Epstein, who would add a couple pieces, but was not seriously trying to win. He would try to add some flippable pieces every year, continue to grow the farm system, accumulate draft picks, and then he was able to hit on them, which was an almost miraculous run of hitting on draft picks. Baltimore's doing it now, but Baltimore had almost a good solid 5, 6, 7 years of tanking, kind of more than the Cubs did. But so the Cubs aren't able to have those draft picks. They've not been spending, I'll say they haven't been spending aggressive money. And I think where the discussion goes there's always talk that the Ricketts are cheap or Jed is cheap. They're not really cheap. They're spending $233 million. They're spending almost $100 million more than every team in the division. They should not be in last place at a $233 million payroll. But the problem is they are spending good solid money on corner outfielders that give you good solid production, which is fine. But there's no star. There's no anchor to the lineup. They're spending $177 million over 7 seasons on an elite defensive shortstop that should be able to give you 25 home runs and isn't. Again, what's the rest of that deal going to look like? If this year's a blip and Dansby's playing hurt a bunch and he's back next year and he hits, we all kind of have to recalibrate our idea of batting average when the entire league as a whole is hitting 242. But if Dansby Swanson can come back next year, be kind of who he's always been, hit 250, 260, give 25 home runs with that elite defense, that changes his value significantly over what he's given this year. There are places to plug in and find it, but they've spent money, but they've not spent money super aggressively. They've spent at the mid and upper mid tier of the market. Jamison Tyone is very fairly paid at $17 million for 4 years. And he's got 2 years left. He's having a great year. He's a good pitcher. He's always been a good pitcher. He's never been a great pitcher. He's not going to go win a Cy Young. Now, they've developed Justin Steele. He appears to be a great pitcher right now. They have some potential guys in the system who could be great pitchers. But this offseason, what are they going to do? Are they going to go be aggressive and try to make a move on like a Corbin Burns? Are they going to try to go out and get a Juan Soto? Are they going to get aggressive and give up some really serious prospect capital to wherever, Miami, some team that's not very good but has a couple of really good young players? The A's, Mason Miller. I know he got the hot start and fell back a little bit, but is that a guy that maybe you want to try to make a move for? They got Shane Langoliers at catcher too. Do the Cubs want to take some serious capital and go make a big move for some good young players that do have some cost control? Cost control is a very real thing. I know fans hate hearing it, but the way you're able, regardless of what market you're in, whether you're big market, small market, even the big market teams can go get Juan Soto and Aaron Judge because they've got, pre-arb and arb guys filling up 6 to 8 spots on the roster. So, teams like the Yankees and the Mets do spend more. The Cubs should spend more. But if you have the young, talented system and you can fill, half your offensive lineup and half your pitching staff with guys who are arb or pre-arb, that's going to free up a lot of cash to go pay some really, really good baseball players. And that's what the Cubs need to do. And with that, I'm going to wrap this one up. I have had so much fun podcasting. It is such a creative outlet for me. I'm a former reporter and journalist, so kind of getting back into following the Cubs every day and kind of piecing ideas together for a story is like bringing some of my past life into what I do today. Until I started, didn't realize how much I'd missed it. And I really appreciate those of you who listen. I've had great feedback from you guys. I've had a couple listener episodes, a lot of great interactions on social media. Cubs fans are full of some great people and some really, really excellent trolls. And I'm having a blast with this thing. I really appreciate you guys listening, and hopefully we'll get 81 more for at least a complete 162 game season. Go Cubs. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you so much for the support over these 2 years. If you liked this episode, or if you've liked any episode, please drop a rating and a review wherever it is you get your podcasts, and share an episode with a friend. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus. And check out the Patreon page, patreon.com/CubsPS Plus to help support the show. As always, the theme music for this podcast is Prospect Park West by Jerry McCoy. This is Mike Waller, host of the CubsPS Plus podcast. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!